Welcome to this week's episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. On this week's episode, we talk about how we are not alone and the silent support that we are getting from very unusual sources. Let's get started. For many of my listeners who have been around on the podcast for a while, I've heard a lot from various people through social media, people in real life, talking, about the feelings of isolation, the feelings of being alone in this whole unfortunate situation when there are what feels like endless amounts of anti-Israel and anti-Jewish protests, the propaganda, the news coverage constantly blaming Israel and the Jews for their own anti-Semitism that's happening against them. It really is endless, and it feels sometimes like you are running up against a massive, impossible task of either A, being proud, or B, fighting back against this tide of hate and blood libels and pretty much everything. On this podcast, I wanted to talk a little bit about some stories that have happened to myself, my wife, and maybe give you a little bit of a hope for those who are feeling alone, to realize that we are not alone in this situation. And so I think these stories that happened recently were really emblematic of this silent support that we are getting from places that maybe we don't always see, or maybe we don't always recognize. And so these two stories that I'm about to tell are 100% true. I'll go into some of the details of who these people are, but I won't give any personal information about them. But I thought that sharing it might give you guys some hope in realizing we are not alone in this. This first story, we can go back only a week because it happened to my wife and I while we were walking our dog this past week. It is early evening and my wife and I are taking our dog for the evening walk. It's a beautiful night and we come across our neighbor. Now this neighbor we have talked to once in a while, hey, how's it going? Nothing too deep, nothing too personal. We happen to know that this gentleman and his family are from Iran. They're Persians and, we have no problem with them. And my wife and I, as much as we are very proud Jews, are always a little bit hesitant, and we're going to talk about this a little later, about showing off our Judaism outwardly. We are not by any means Orthodox Jews that you would be able to pick us out from a crowd. We also don't drape ourselves in the Israeli flag every time we go and take our dog for a walk. So it's not exactly like you would recognize us as being Jewish per se. And as many Jewish people understand, people listening to this podcast might already have this in their mind, is we obviously don't understand or don't know what other people are thinking. And maybe it's an unfortunate situation of when you're Jewish, you tend to kind of get used to hiding and not really talking about politics or the fact that you're Jewish to certain types of people, depending on where they come from. And we all know that Iran tends to, unfortunately, not care much for Jews and for Israel based on the country. So you never really know when people come from these countries what their opinion is. So this gentleman, we were always courteous and polite, no problems. We've had our dog play with their kids and, never really gone into politics or talked about religion, anything like that. But this evening was a little different. The gentleman was sitting out with his brother, who he later told us was his brother. And the two of them are just sitting and having a great night. And he's, playing with our dog. And he says to us kind of oddly that he's really sad, and he asked if we had heard the news about the president of Iran being killed in that helicopter crash. And of course, my wife and I, as many Jewish people probably understand, our hearts sunk, and we didn't know what to do. This guy is saying, did you hear about it? We don't want to get into politics or talk about things like this. And we kind of just acknowledged that we had heard of the story and we knew what happened. And he said, he's really sad about the fact that the president of Iran had passed away. And our hearts dropped. We didn't know what to say. We were thinking, obviously, this is a sign that this gentleman is very pro-Islamic regime, which is very anti-Jewish. And we were a little nervous, as many of you can probably understand. Anybody who's Jewish knows that feeling of being caught between your Judaism and someone who you think might hate you. So my wife and I gazed at each other with a worried look on our faces. We didn't really know what to make of this. And so we kind of just nodded along and said, that's such a crazy story. We obviously didn't go into if we agreed with it or not agreed with it, but he kept talking about it and we were really uncomfortable, to be honest with you. And then it turned to all of a sudden him saying, I really wish he wasn't killed in a helicopter crash. I wish he was on a train or a boat. and there were 200 other people just like him on the boat when they died. And my wife and I, again, kind of looked at each other, not realizing what does he mean by that? And we didn't want to make any assumptions. But after testing the waters a little bit and not really wanting to commit to one way or the other in this conversation, he very clearly said that he is very much against the regime. He is so happy that the president of Iran is dead because clearly he himself, being in Canada, is not a supporter of the regime and is very anti-regime, which goes for many people who have left Iran. Most of the people who have left Iran don't care for the regime, which is why they left. The people who are still there are much more in fear of the regime or supportive of the regime. And so my wife and I obviously had this big sigh of, oh, thank goodness that's not going the way we worried it would go. And then this gentleman went on a very long rant, a good one, about how much he dislikes the regime and how oppressive they are. I guess he recognized we were Jewish, and we had no idea he knew we were Jewish. He said, "We support Israel. We love Israel. It is so sad, and I feel so bad for what your people are going through right now. We understand what it's like, just like you guys, to live under this threat of the Iranian regime, and we support you in every way." And this man, in his 50s or so, is looking like he's almost in tears telling us. And again, you have to remember, this gentleman really didn't talk to us more than a, hello, how's it going? We never really got personal. And he's telling us at this point how much he loves us, my wife and I, and how much he supports us and he feels for us. And I never would have imagined I'd hear this from just a, somewhat random neighbor, let alone someone who comes from Iran. We didn't really know what his stance was. And we didn't realize that he had figured out we were Jewish. It could be because of the mezuzah on our door. For anyone who's not Jewish, it's the little prayer that's put on every Jewish door and every Jewish home, people who choose to put it on their doors. So this gentleman might be aware of the fact that we are Jewish by seeing that on our door. Maybe he's seen my wife, who often wears a Hebrew necklace. Maybe I've worn some IDF shirts and he's recognized it. I don't know. But he obviously recognized us to be Jewish. And for some reason, after, I would say, at least years of seeing this person back and forth once in a while, he felt the need, out of the clear blue sky, because the president of Iran had been killed a while ago, to tell us that he supports us and that he feels for us as Jews. He sees what's going on. He had to share. It seems like it was weighing on him almost. He'd wanted to share that with us. And we were so unbelievably touched by this moment. He went on to tell us, essentially, that the Jews of Persia, prior to the Islamic regime, when the Jews of Persia were there and able to live freely, along with even the Persian people, he was saying how they used to get along so well, and that he, back in Iran, had no problem and loved the Jews and thought the Jews were amazing people, and that regime is terrible and doesn't represent Persian people. This conversation literally blew our minds. Like, at the end, I honestly just wanted to hug this man, because we finally felt seen and heard, and we had our support from a place that we might not have expected it. But after thinking about it, it really makes a lot of sense. And we're going to get into that a little bit at the end of this podcast, why this makes sense. But that interaction was honestly just so touching. And every time we see him now, he literally ends every interaction with, he loves us. Love you guys. We love you guys. Honestly, words can't express how touched and how connected I feel with these people now, that we were originally afraid to even admit we're Jewish or show off that we're Jewish because we didn't really understand, is this person for or against Israel, things like that. But I also realized one thing. It's possible that this gentleman too wasn't feeling comfortable enough to share with us his feelings about Jews and Israel and anti-Islamic regime, because I wondered that if he knew we were Jewish, maybe he didn't feel comfortable bringing it up to us because he feared that we had some sort of negative feelings towards him, knowing that he's Persian. Like, maybe he was feeling uncomfortable with telling us he loved us and he supported us because maybe he had some prejudice, thinking, well, Jews aren't going to like me because I'm from Iran. Jews are not going to trust me when I want to say something nice. Jews. It's possible that he was actually scared himself to bring this up. Which also ties in a little bit to my next story. Well, this wasn't recent, but it actually touched my wife and I really, really deeply. It seems like everything revolves around our dog. So we were also walking our dog, and we have some neighbors who live just down the street, and they also have dogs. So our dogs have played with each other for years. And honestly, some of the nicest, most amazing people, a husband and wife and their kids, we got along great with them. But we did hear from them a few times that they were from the country of Lebanon. So, of course, my wife and I, as Jews often do, are very careful and cautious to talk about us being Jewish or that we support the state of Israel because, unfortunately, in Lebanon, as many of you know from the north right now, some people in Lebanon don't care much for Jews. Unfortunately, that country is very heavily anti-Israel because of the education system and because of the Arab world, so on and so on. So my wife and I tried to keep our distance emotionally in that way. We didn't tell them we were Jewish. We didn't talk about Israel, anything like that. And one day as our dogs are playing, the conversation somehow turned essentially to where we were from. And so my wife and I, after the whole decolonize Judea movement started, and I've got an old podcast on that, we tell people typically that we are from Israel because we're Jewish and every Jew comes from Israel at one point in time. So we were very hesitant when they asked us where we're from, what to say. So we kind of looked at each other in hesitation. These are people from Lebanon. Maybe they're not so happy with Jews and so on and so on. But we eventually admitted, because we aren't going to hide who we are, that we are Jews and we are from the state of Israel from way, way, way back. And to our amazement, this husband and wife actually said, "Oh, that's amazing. We love Israel." And we were, again, shocked. We thought, we don't know how these people feel about Israel, but they apparently love the state of Israel. We found out that these were Lebanese Druze. For anybody who doesn't know much about the Druze, there are Druze in the northern part of Israel, in Lebanon, in Syria, and these are a sect of Arabs who are not Muslims. They have their own religion. And these Lebanese Druze, unfortunately, because they are a minority, tend to get treated very badly in certain countries, which includes Lebanon. Not so much in Israel. The Druze are amazing fighters for Israel. They fight in the army. Part of their religion is actually to be incredibly loyal and protect whatever country you're in. No matter what country you're in, if you're in Lebanon, if you're in Israel, you support that country. That is part of their belief and their religion and their faith. So interestingly, these people had stories they were telling us because they are both from Lebanon, and both of them were there in the 1980s when Israel and Lebanon were at war. So again, we kind of feared where this was going. And they were telling us stories about how amazing Israel is and that amazing stuff that Israel was doing in order to help the Lebanese people from Hezbollah and from the terrorists and from the Islamic extremists who treated the Druze and everybody else terribly. They repeated numerous times to us how much they wish and they prayed back in the 80s that Israel would finish the job, unlike what we're seeing now, unfortunately, with Hamas, where the world is trying to stop Israel short of actually destroying Hamas. These Lebanese people were saying we wished Israel would have finished the job because Lebanon would be beautiful and a free country again and not this terror state that has destroyed the country. And they said over and over again, they wish Israel would even now come back in and finish the job. And what's even more amazing is this gentleman's wife told my wife that her sister, her own sister, was killed in a 1980s bombing by the Israelis. And still she says that it was an unfortunate situation, but Israel did the right thing to take out terrorists. A woman whose own sister was killed still to this day supports Israel and believes what Israel is doing is right, taking out the extremists. I was at a loss for words to hear things like this. But even more amazingly, a story that the husband told me was just unbelievable. So the story goes, if I can give you the short form, is he was conscripted into the Lebanese army, and he wasn't really much of a fighter. He said, I didn't want to be a part of it, but I was forced to. So I would kind of pretend to shoot or shoot way over people's heads. I didn't want to kill anybody. I didn't believe in what I was fighting for, but I had to fight, but I didn't want to hurt anybody. And he told me the story that every weekend when he'd go home from the base after training or fighting or whatever it was, he would go home and see this homeless man who'd sit outside in the streets on his way home. And every Friday he would buy him a shawarma and a Coke and say, here you go. I'm sorry. This is what I can give you. Just keep up your spirits, and so on, just to help this poor homeless man. And he did this for a few weeks. He gave him whatever he could in order to help him, this poor man who was living on the streets. And then one day, when the Israeli army came in, the Israelis captured the soldiers and brought them in for interrogation, which is typical. And what happened was, this gentleman was actually taken into interrogation, and he's walking down the hall getting ready to go into an interrogation, and he sees a familiar face. It was cleaner shaved, it was a nice haircut, but he recognized the person. And it turns out it was the homeless man. The homeless man who'd been sitting on the streets was actually a spy for the Israelis. And when the Israelis saw this Lebanese guy in custody, he immediately went to him in the interrogation room and said, "Because you are such a great man and you helped me every week and you bought me food because you thought I was homeless, I know you are a good person. You are not about war and killing and death. I will get you out. Don't worry, no problem." And so the man leaves. But before he leaves, our neighbor, the Lebanese gentleman, said to him, "Please do me a favor. I have friends who are in my unit that are not wanting to harm anybody. Please, can you find a way to get them out of custody too?" And sure enough, the gentleman came back a few minutes later and told the Lebanese neighbor of mine, "You're free to go. You and your friends can leave." And he got them out of custody because he knew that these were good people. When my neighbor was telling us this story, his eyes lit up. He knew and he knows that Israel is an incredible army that does the right thing. And when they let them go, it's because they knew that they don't want to hurt anybody. They don't want to interrogate people who don't deserve to be interrogated. Israel is an honorable army that is doing nothing but trying to save its own people. But also, he said, save the Druze people in Lebanon, save the Arab and the Christian people in Lebanon who are not supportive of terror. He recognized that Israel is an incredibly moral army and does the right thing. In the end, these are two very anecdotal stories, obviously. This doesn't represent every Lebanese or every Persian person. But what I wanted to express through these stories is two things. One, that maybe some people aren't able or willing to share with you how much they support you and being a Jew and Israel and things like that, because a lot of these people come from countries where speaking out against the government is incredibly dangerous. So maybe they're a little hesitant to talk to you, not realizing or not knowing how you feel about things. Are you going to be mad at them? Are you going to think that they hate you? We have to remember this intense fear that comes from living in a country with a dictatorship who will lock you up, kill you, hang you for speaking out against the government. Or even, if you go to Iran today, speaking out in support of Israel, which is an incredibly difficult and dangerous thing to do. And secondly, and most importantly, I think what these stories show is the irony in this entire situation. Here we have people who have themselves lived under the oppression and the terrorism and the horrible governments of Iran or Iran proxies or whatever it might be in the Middle East. These people have lived it and have seen Israel and Jews and the army and appreciate what they're doing and support what they're doing. And then meanwhile, we see people who have never stepped foot in Lebanon, in Iran, in any of these countries that they support, supposedly, and yet they are 100% in support of Iran and the Intifada and all this BS we hear on the streets today. But the people themselves who've lived there under these governments don't support it. What does that tell you about what side of the argument you're on? The people who live under these governments don't support the governments. The people who don't live under those governments, who live in a free country, apparently support those governments. It goes to show you how backwards things have become. And it goes to show how little you yourself know about the conflict, that people who actually live there are against these governments and these oppressive regimes, but you apparently know better than them? It really only goes to show how really stupid people are in the West, that they don't even listen to the voices of the people in Gaza who are anti-Hamas, the people in Lebanon who are anti-Hezbollah, the people in Iran who are anti-Islamic regime. These people know the problems, and you think you know better. So hopefully some of you who are listening to this podcast, maybe who are a little bit down, feeling isolated, feeling like nobody supports you and that you're on your own, remember that you're not always on your own. Not only are the people around you on social media, in this podcast, your friends, your relatives, your family, Everybody here is on your side, but there also might be some people who you don't expect are on your side, or maybe aren't able or aren't comfortable telling you that they are on your side. We have recently seen a massive uptick of Iranian Persian people, so people who are not in support of the Islamic regime, the people whose country has been taken over by Islamic terrorists and does not represent their culture or their background or their feelings towards Jews in the state of Israel. For anybody who's listening to this, remember, you are absolutely not alone, and there is support out there for you. It just may sometimes be a little silent. This has been another episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. Don't forget to check us out on social media at jdr.podcast and check out some of our other episodes on your favorite podcast source. We'll see you next time.